Okay. Hi, everyone. This is Steve Wernick, Reb Steve, one of the rabbis at Beth Tzedek Congregation in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. And you are joining us for Conversations Over Coffee, our weekly video blog with interesting people around interesting topics during an interesting time. We are happy to welcome today Dr. Seymour Epstein, affectionately known as Epi in the greater Toronto Jewish community area. Epi has spent many years, almost more than 2 decades, I think, right? Or just about 2 decades in
in
Morocco.
well, not all that time in Morocco. 18 years with the joint, and many of those years were in Morocco.
So Epi worked 18 years with the Joint Distribution Committee and spent many of those years in Morocco. And today, we're going to talk about Morocco, Israel, the Jews, the future, and so forth. But even before we do that, Epi, I think not everybody in our Jewish community is familiar with all the different institutions of the Jewish community. So why don't we start with you just telling us a little bit about the Joint Distribution Committee, its work, and so forth.
Sure. The American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee is its long name. Most people refer to it as the Joint. In different countries, we use different names depending on the politics of the country. The Joint was formed in 1914 in response to a very specific issue about originally Russian Jews who ended up as Olim in Israel and were suffering problems of malaria and illnesses, all kinds of things in the early days of the 20th century. And then decided that the way to help in general was through a joint distribution committee, that is bringing to various charities that existed at that point in the States, Jewish charities together so that they could help. We were in Russia before the revolution. We were there for the revolution. And ever since then have been working in countries around the world where Jews are in a situation where they need our help. In most cases, distressed communities for one reason or another. But the Joint has a huge operation in Israel, which is hardly a distressed community, but contributed certain kinds of things that only the Joint could do. So that's the nature of the organization. It's based in New York. That's where the headquarters are, and usually is funded through UJA and through other kinds of sources of income that fit into the sort of the charitable character of the JDC.
And what was the nature of your work specifically in Morocco?
So in Morocco, I went originally on a 2-year contract to be what is called a conseiller pédagogique. Morocco is French and Arabic speaking, an educational consultant for the Jewish schools that the Joint was a funder of in those days. I went there in 1981 originally, and I was on a 2-year contract, but I fell in love with the Joint and eventually stayed on for 18 years in various places. I then in Morocco, I moved from being an educational consultant to what is called a country director, in charge of the whole operation of the Joint in Morocco, which includes, of course, social welfare and health, youth activities, formal education, a lot of different activities that helped a community that at that point numbered roughly 15,000 Jews, a community that was once 250,000 strong, say in 1945.
And then, so I'm assuming, also based on history, that once Israel was established, a lot of the Jews of Morocco left. Was it a forced expulsion, or was it a voluntary, or a little bit of both?
Well, that's what's unique about the Jews of Morocco and to some extent other parts of North Africa, but especially Morocco. It was not a forced expulsion. In fact, His Majesty the King At that point in the early days, say from 45 to 61, Muhammad V very much wanted the Jews to stay. His son, later the king, Hassan II, also. And this king now, Muhammad VI, same story. But there were factors that caused the Jews to leave. The first and foremost was in 1948, the establishment of the State of Israel. Traditional Jews, especially Berber Jews in the mountains and the rural Jews, they were very traditional. And when they heard a state had been established, it was for them a kind of a messianic moment. And they just decided to leave immediately and did so. The urban Jews left, for the most part, at later dates, not all of them to Israel, some to France, some to Quebec, as we know, some to Toronto even. But the exodus took place in stages depending on what was happening. One was Moroccan independence in 1956. That scared some people. They just weren't sure what an independent Muslim state was going to look like for them. So although they were encouraged to stay, many of them decided that the better route was to leave. 1961, the death of Muhammad V. They just weren't sure what his son was going to be like in terms of the Jews, and other Jews left, mostly urban Jews. 1967, the war. 1973, the Yom Kippur War. There were just moments when it just seemed to make sense. There were some disturbances here and there, but nothing like what happened in Iraq or other places. The Jews, if anything, were encouraged to stay.
And out of those Jews that stayed, though, I mean, like, in a lot of similar circumstances, the people that leave can, and the people that remain behind are the people that weren't able to leave. Was that true for the Moroccan community as well? So is one of the reasons why there was such a need for those kinds of social services, education, medical supplies, and so forth, because that the population that stayed was primarily poorer, less educated, less mobile?
Well, less mobile for a variety of reasons. There was some serious poverty, and that's why we were there. Part of the reason we were there. Initially, in the late 40s and early 50s, there was a tremendous amount of disease in the mountains, especially issues around vision. And the joint was very active in those kinds of things. Sure, the people who stayed behind for a variety of reasons. But I must tell you that when I arrived in 81, there was still a significant middle class and a significant upper middle class living in Morocco. And some of those people stayed because they had businesses and they were doing well, and life was good for them. And life in Morocco is a good life, can be at any rate. And it was a mixed community. Now there clearly is. There are really only about 2,000 Jews left at this point. There's still some mix, but for the most part, what's left are the people that, for one reason or another, just couldn't leave.
And during the time which you were there, it seems from the outside that the king and the government of Morocco has been pretty good to the Jews, not only encouraging them to stay, but even when they did, ensuring protection, ability to pray, and so forth. Is that true? And what else did the king do to maintain, decent relationships with the Jewish people?
Well, I'll tell you one personal story. I went to Morocco first for a week in the spring of 1981. The Joint wanted to know whether I was suited to Morocco and whether Morocco was suited to me. So they sent me there for a week to see what I thought of the whole idea of living there and working there. And as I was leaving my hotel at the end of that week, the fellow who was taking care of my room took me to the elevator with my luggage and asked me if I was Jewish. And I was a little nervous in those days about saying I was Jewish in a Muslim country, but I said yes. And he said the following: the saddest day in the history of Morocco is the day the Jews decided to leave. There's absolutely no doubt that, along with some problems over the centuries, for sure, the relationship of Jews and Muslims in Morocco was one of peaceful, mostly of peaceful coexistence. There were moments, but for the most part, it was a good relationship, most especially between the Berbers in the mountains and the Berber Jews who lived in the same area of the High Atlas and the Sahara. There's been a lot of writing about that lately. Um, but it's the only country I know of outside of Israel where the Hebrew date still appears on the masthead of the daily newspaper.
Hmm.
Um, the Jewish existence in Morocco is one that Moroccans in general, Muslims, Arabs, and Berbers together have pride in. And there were numerous occasions when it became evident to me through the times that during the time that I was there, that centuries of a very interesting coexistence meant a lot to both Jews and Muslims. And that's coming out now in the news as after this new peace accord, which will eventually end up in diplomatic relations.
Um, when you were there, were there back channel communications between the government and Israel? Did you play any role with that? Or were you just more like a fly on the wall?
Anybody who works for the joint, all their relatives think, they're spies. No, I had no role in anything to do with Israel-Moroccan relations, but there is no doubt that there were bilateral relations, and that's what's unique about this particular accord compared to the other accords with Bahrain and UAE and Sudan. There were for decades such arrangements. We had one moment where we realized that Shimon Peres, Alava Shalom, was in Morocco visiting the king, and he was visiting the king in one of the kings. This is His Majesty King Hassan II. He was visiting the king in one of the king's summer resort palaces in a town called Ifran. Ifran is about, I don't know, 15, 20 kilometers from a little village called Imuzer, where we were running a summer camp for Jewish kids. And Paris, of course, didn't know that just down the road, a whole bunch of Jewish kids were having a wonderful time with this in their summer camp. But there clearly were lots of relations over the years. There was even a short period, I think in the late 90s, when there was a bit of an office in Rabat, an Israel trade office in Rabat. But there's been a relationship, and this is what happened now. In addition to the pressure that came from the American government, this is it was a kind of natural eventuality, and I'm very pleased about it.
Why do you think it happened at this moment?
Well, it fit in because of the other Arab states that were interested in um, a new relationship, and I think it had to come sooner or later, and I guess His Majesty Mohammed VI, sorry, must have thought that this was just the right time. There's going to be some opposition to it within the Moroccan, maybe even in the government, but definitely amongst the Moroccan people. Like everywhere else in the Arab world, young Moroccans, Arabs and Berbers, came under the influence of pan-Arab nationalism, pro-Palestinian sentiment, etc. That was natural, and there'll be some debate about the whole thing, but it is a kingdom, and His Majesty Mohammed VI made a historic decision, which I think is not only good for Israel, but absolutely very, very good for Morocco as well.
In what ways do you think it's going to be good for Morocco?
Well, one thing it's going to do is increase a lot of Jewish tourism and Israeli tourism. Now, the fact is that over the past couple of decades already, Israeli tourism has been a very important factor in Morocco. Israelis were permitted to come in under special conditions through tours, and on my tours, we kept running into Israelis all the time in all the key cities. There'll be that. There'll be lots of trade. I can imagine one simple thing that one could imagine is that something as simple as solar heating for water would be an obvious thing in Morocco. There's a little bit of it, but not anywhere near as much as in Israel. And I would imagine somebody's going to take an initiative in that area. But there'll be many, many other areas in science, in culture, where there'll be exchanges back and forth. And I think both countries will benefit from it's a new old relationship, because any Moroccan over the age of 50 knows that the Jews were a very, very important part of this culture. You have to remember that in 1945, when there were 250 or 275,000 Jews, there were only 8 million Moroccans. And that percentage of Jews played a very, very important part in the economy of the country in a variety of different areas. The first postmaster or minister of posts, or whatever it was called, in 1956, when Morocco became independent, was a Jew. And since then, Jews have served in the government. So that even when the Jewish population was diminished greatly, they just are a very, very important part of Morocco's past and even Morocco's present.
Do you think that'll lead to Moroccans traveling to Israel?
I would guess it will. I
Unlike Jordan
absolutely
and
will.
Egypt, there's been a
Yeah.
cold peace, so to speak.
Yeah.
But the language that you said of a new old relationship is interesting. So do you think Moroccans will go to Israel?
Oh, absolutely. I can imagine tours being set up already, and there'll be plenty of Moroccans in Israel who speak Moghrabi, Moroccan Arabic, that will be happy to lead those tours through. And of course, there are lots of French-speaking Israelis as well who would be happy to lead those tours, and Moroccans would be fascinated by all parts of Israel. The Jewish past, the Christian past, and the Islamic past of Israel, and its vibrant present as well.
Over the time that you spent there, what are some of the things that you're most proud of?
Oh well, we played an interesting role there, and I think it was probably in the area of education, because that's my field, where I had most impact. We First of all, I have to tell you that I took away much more than I gave. And I learned a tremendous amount about Sephardic culture, about the unique qualities of Moroccan Jewish culture in all kinds of areas. I left being able to lead tefillot, prayer services in the Moroccan style. I learned a lot, but what I think we're most proud of is we helped the schools. We helped them financially, of course, but we also helped them in very specific areas of education. Uh, the early childhood education in Morocco was greatly influenced by our Paris office, and one woman in particular, Evelyn Peters, Aliyah Shalom, who was the early childhood consultant for all of the joint throughout the world, and had a great influence, of which I've written here and there, on early childhood education in all the different school systems. There were 4 different school systems when I arrived: Otzar Torah, the Alliance Israélite, which in Morocco is called Ittihad, the Lubavitch, Chabad, and Ort. By now, it's really only Otzar Torah and the Alliance. But in each of the school systems, We brought in consultants. We did pedagogic training. We helped with the summer camp programs, and there was tremendous sense of accomplishment and gratitude on the part of the community. When I go back to Morocco, I meet with people that we worked with, and they have wonderful memories of the things that we did over the years there.
Did a lot of so I know, like, from the Jewish Agency perspective, Jewish Agency runs summer camps and supports other kind of programs and partners with the Joint and others. What was one of the goals, especially from summer camps and older, was getting some of the young people on birthright, and then looking towards a possibility of Aliyah for them. So, was there continue to be an exodus from Morocco of young adults to Israel?
So that's a tricky question. In my day, there was no birthright, but there were programs in Israel. The Joint had to be very careful politically to be apolitical and to not be involved in Zionist activity outright. You have to remember that there was a sharp distinction in those days, before this new accord now, there was a sharp distinction between philo-Semitism and any kind of approach that was seen as Zionistic. So officially, we couldn't involve ourselves in Zionist activity, and we had to be very careful even about terminology. There's a funny story. We referred to Israel in those days, it was telex, not email. We referred to Israel as Texas, and a new CEO came into the Joint to take over the leadership of the Joint, and he noticed in a telex that I was sending teachers to Houston for Hebrew training. And he went around the office in New York saying, "What's wrong with this Epstein?
What the hell's going on, right?
Why is he
Why
sending
Houston
to Texas for Hebrew training?" And of course, I was sending people to Jerusalem quietly, so that we had to be
by way of Houston? That's a long
right.
flight. You had to fly to Houston in order to catch
by way of Paris, actually, because there were no direct flights, and there will be soon. So we had to be careful. The Jewish Agency had a quiet presence available for people who were ready for Aliyah, and we did everything to enable, especially if they were poor, to enable their leaving. But we were not involved in any way, shape, or form in Zionist activity or in anything that had to do with the immigration to Israel. And there was very little at that point already, because the community was reduced to much smaller numbers. But what did exist existed. It was pretty common knowledge that if you wanted to go to Israel, you knew where to go. I'll tell you one funny story. They tell of a Jew who came from the Bled, from the countryside, and wanted to find the office of the person who dealt with Aliyah. And he was given an address, but he had never seen a multi-story building before. And when he got to this office building, he didn't know what to do. He came from a village where there were really only one-story buildings. So he went into the gas station across the road, and he asked the fellow in Arabic, "Fin Filistin, where's Palestine?" And the guy told him, "Oh, David, on the fourth floor." So, there was common knowledge, but things were handled discreetly, very discreetly. And this will appear in the history books at some point in the future about how all these things took place. But it was a peaceful immigration, and as I said, of course, Jews didn't only go to Israel; they went elsewhere as well.
What are you hearing from your contacts in Morocco about this agreement and the possibilities for the future?
Unfortunately, what I'm hearing about is the fact that COVID has had a huge impact on the Jewish community for some reason. And one of my very closest friends and teachers died of COVID early on in the pandemic. So mostly they're talking about that. But I haven't been back. I can't travel now. And although I'm sure there's lots of excitement, and I've seen some of it through emails, there's no reason why the Jews wouldn't be very excited about this, and would probably not be terribly surprised either, because I think they knew the day was coming when there would be a much closer relationship than existed before. Jews were going back and forth over the decades with very little difficulty, and this is just going to make it a lot easier. And you never know, there could even be, don't quote me, but there could even be some immigration to Morocco by some Moroccans who, from Israel or elsewhere, decided that this was a good time to go back to the homeland. But what Moroccan Jews love to do are these roots trips where they go back and see where their parents or grandparents came from.
Any final words, Epi?
No, just that I think it's an especially exciting moment, and I'm hoping that as soon as we conquer this terrible virus, I'll be back doing tours to Morocco, Jewish heritage tours, because I think this will open up all kinds of new possibilities, and I think we're going to see some exciting exchanges back and forth, primarily in business, but also probably in the world of culture and even education.
Thanks, Epi. If you want to find out more about the American Joint Distribution Committee, look them up online. It is one of the major organs of the international Jewish world that does a lot of work in supporting Jewish communities that are at risk. And Epi, thank you for your decades of service to the Joint and to the Jewish people. Thank you for sharing your insights about Morocco and what this new agreement means for both Israel, Morocco, and the Jews. Lots of things happening at Bet Tzedek. Don't forget, today is we continue with our daily Tanakh study. We're in the book of 2 Kings. Very exciting about the trials and tribulations, the ups and downs of the kingdoms of Israel from the time of the prophets. That's at 3 p.m. on Facebook. This evening, my Talmud Shiur continues at 7:30. Learn Talmud at your own pace. And then coming up, we want everybody to know about an evening with Steve Circa, who will be interviewing Conrad Black. That's a community event in the GTA tomorrow, Tuesday, January 5th. And we encourage you to check out Bet Tzedek online at our website, www.beth-tzedec.org, for all the opportunities to remain spiritually near at this time of physical distance. As Epi said, we hope and pray that this virus will come to an end soon, that the vaccine rollout continues with speed, and in the meantime, we want to encourage everyone to practice all the safety regulations of public health. Wear a mask, practice physical distance, wash your hands regularly, and be safe and smart. Thanks everyone for joining us. Have a